What if a film was so disturbing, so defiantly ahead of its time, that theaters would only screen it at midnight for those brave enough to watch? These weren't just movies. They were cinematic lightning bolts that sparked bans, protests, and walkouts. Some vanished after a week. Others built underground followings that refused to die. And here's the twist. Their real power wasn't in how much they shocked, it was in how impossible they were to silence. Number 15, Reefer Madness, 1936. It started as a warning, it ended as a joke. Reefer Madness was originally funded by a church group to scare parents about marijuana, claiming one puff could turn a clean-cut teen into a raving maniac. The plot? A wholesome boy tries a joint at a party and within hours is involved in hit and runs, hallucinations, and accidental manslaughter. Yes, really. But here's the twist. Nobody took it seriously, not even in 1936. Audiences laughed at the over-the-top acting, the wild plot twists, and the sheer absurdity of blaming a single plant for every societal ill. The film flopped instantly and vanished for decades. Then, in the 1960s, counterculture activists rediscovered it not as propaganda, but as satire. They started screening it at midnight shows, handing out popcorn, and shouting lines like, "Reefer makes you see things." Suddenly, it wasn't a warning anymore. It was a punchline against fear-mongering. The US government even tried to destroy all copies, but bootleg reels survived. Today, it's public domain, fully available on YouTube and the Internet Archive, and studied as a classic example of moral panic gone comically wrong. So, was it controversial? At the time, absolutely. But history had the last laugh, and that's why it kicked off the midnight movie revolution. Not because it scared people, but because it reminded them not to be afraid of nonsense. Number 14, Freaks, 1932. Imagine casting real sideshow performers, not actors pretending, but people who live their lives on the margins and then building a horror story around them, where they become the Avengers. That's Freaks, Todd Browning's audacious, deeply misunderstood masterpiece that didn't just flop, it got erased. Released in 1932, at the height of Hollywood glamour, this film dared to show people with physical differences not as monsters, but as a tight-knit community betrayed by a so-called normal woman who only wanted their money. The studio, MGM, panicked before it even hit theaters. Test audiences screamed, some reportedly fainted. One theater manager said patrons ran out crying. Within weeks, the film was pulled, cut from 90 minutes to just over 60, and banned in multiple countries for decades. Browning's career never recovered, but here's the twist. The Freaks weren't the villains. The real monster was greed and hypocrisy. For years, the only way to see Freaks was at underground, screenings or midnight movie marathons in the 1960s and 70s, where it found a new audience that saw its humanity, not its shock value. Today, it's preserved in the National Film Registry. The full original cut may be lost, but enough remains to prove this wasn't exploitation, it was empathy wrapped in horror. So, was it too disturbing for its time? Absolutely. But maybe that's exactly why it needed to exist. Number 13. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, 1975. It bombed so hard its studio pulled it after just 1 week, yet within months it rose from the dead, not in theaters, but in the shadows of midnight. The Rocky Horror Picture Show wasn't just a musical, it was a revolution in fishnet stockings. Starring Tim Curry as the seductive Dr. Frank-N-Furter, it mixed sci-fi, glam rock, and gender-bending chaos into something mainstream America wasn't ready for. 20th Century Fox had no idea how to sell it. Was it a comedy, a horror parody, a love letter to outsider identity? They marketed it like a standard release. Audiences were confused. Critics called it bizarre and exhausting. It vanished fast until a theater in New York City tried something wild. They screened it at midnight and invited fans to dress up, talk back, and dance in the aisles. Overnight, it became a ritual. People returned week after week, bringing rice to throw during the wedding scene, newspapers for the rain, and flashlights for the time warp. It wasn't just watching a movie, it was joining a tribe. Today, it's the longest-running theatrical release in history. But back then, it was too queer, too loud, too joyful for daylight. And that's why it had to live after dark, where freedom could finally strut in heels. Number 12, Eraserhead, 1977. Picture a world where everything hums, buzzes, or groans, where walls sweat, radiators whisper, and a man's greatest fear isn't death, it's fatherhood. That's Eraserhead, David Lynch's debut film, a black and white nightmare so strange, so quiet, and so deeply unsettling that it couldn't find a theater willing to show it during regular hours. For years, its only home was the midnight slot at the New Art Theater in Los Angeles, where it ran for over a year straight. Made over 5 grueling years with grant money, student help, and sheer obsession, Eraserhead follows Henry Spencer, a meek man who becomes responsible for a sickly, otherworldly baby after a vague encounter with a woman. There's no clear plot, no heroes, no resolution, just dread, industrial noise, and surreal imagery that sticks to your brain like glue. Lynch shot it frame by frame, often unsure where it was going. Even the cast didn't fully understand it. Critics were baffled, studios passed. But midnight audiences? They came back again and again, dissecting every shadow, every sound. The film became a ritual, a shared experience for those who liked their cinema, weird and wired. Today, it's hailed as a landmark of American surrealism. But in 1977, it was too eerie, too slow, too honest about the terror of responsibility. And that's why it had to live in the dark, until the world finally caught up. Number 11. Putney Swope, 1969. What if a black man accidentally became CEO of a top Madison Avenue ad agency and immediately turned it into a radical anti-establishment machine? That's Putney Swope, Robert Downey Sr.'s razor-sharp satire that was so ahead of its time, mainstream theaters didn't know what to do with it. Shot in stark black and white with guerrilla-style energy, it follows the title character as he renames his firm Truth and Soul, Inc., and starts rejecting car, alcohol, and war-related accounts. In 1969, that wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. Studios feared backlash. Critics called it too angry or too weird. Most theaters refused to book it, so it found its audience at midnight screenings in New York, college campuses, and underground art houses, where crowds cheered every jab at corporate hypocrisy. The film's mix of absurd humor, racial commentary, and media critique felt like a Molotov cocktail wrapped in a cartoon. Downey used non-actors, improvised dialogue, and fake news segments to blur reality and fiction. The result was chaotic, hilarious, and deeply subversive. Today it's seen as a precursor to everything from Mad Men to Sorry to Bother You. But back then, it was too honest, too loud, too smart for prime time, and that's why it had to wait for midnight to speak to those who were ready to listen. Number 10, Night of the Living Dead, 1968. It was just supposed to be a low-budget horror flick shot in rural Pennsylvania, with a cast of locals and a shoestring crew. But Night of the Living Dead became something far bigger and far more unsettling than anyone expected. Directed by George A. Romero, it follows a group of strangers trapped in a farmhouse as the recently deceased begin rising from graves, hungry and relentless. What made it truly radical wasn't the gore, it was the casting. Dwayne Jones, a black actor with theater training, played the lead not as a sidekick or victim, but as the smartest, calmest person in the room. In 1968, that alone was revolutionary. But the studio didn't highlight it. They didn't market it at all. They dumped it into drive-ins and grindhouse theaters, where it shocked audiences with its bleak tone, newsreel-style realism, and downbeat ending. Critics were divided. Some called it gratuitously grim. Others praised its raw power. But the real controversy came from parents and censors. The film had no rating. It was released before the MPAA system existed, so kids saw it in matinees, then had nightmares for weeks. Newspapers ran editorials. Towns banned it. Yet it kept spreading thanks to midnight screenings where fans dissected every frame. Because it fell into the public domain by accident, the distributor forgot to include a copyright notice. Anyone could show it. Churches, colleges, even community centers screened it after dark. That's how it became a cult phenomenon, not through ads, but through word of mouth. Today, it's in the National Film Registry, hailed as a landmark of American cinema. But back then, it was too honest, too dark, too real for daylight. And that's why it had to live in the shadows where the dead walk and the truth waits. Number 9. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Forget jump scares, forget monsters and masks. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre didn't need them. It used grainy film, screeching audio, and raw, documentary-style chaos to make audiences feel like they'd stumbled into a real nightmare. Shot on a shoestring budget in the Texas heat with a cast of unknowns, this film wasn't just scary, it was accused of being real. The story follows a group of friends who wander into the wrong farmhouse and meet a family of butchers who've, well, let's just say they don't welcome guests. Inspired by true crime stories and urban legends, director Tobe Hooper wanted to make a horror film that felt like a news report. The result was so intense that theaters reported people vomiting, fainting, or storming out mid-screening. Several countries banned it outright. In the US, it was slapped with an X rating and only shown in grindhouse theaters often at midnight, when fewer witnesses were around. But here's the irony. There's almost no graphic violence. The terror comes from what you don't see: the sounds, the panic, the relentless chase. It's psychological horror disguised as exploitation. Over time, critics reevaluated it as a masterpiece of tension and social commentary about oil crises, family decay, and rural despair. Now, it's in the National Film Registry, but back then, it was too raw, too real, too much, and that's why it had to wait for the witching hour to be seen. Number 8. Scorpio Rising, 1963. You've never seen anything like Scorpio Rising. It's not a story. It's a collision of biker culture, pop music, Nazi imagery, and religious iconography all smashed together in a 13-minute fever dream. Made by experimental filmmaker Kenneth Anger, this short film used Elvis songs, James Dean posters, and swastikas not to glorify, but to expose the dark undercurrents of American obsession with rebellion, death, and idol worship. The moment it screened, chaos followed. Police raided theaters, prints were seized. In one famous case, a judge ruled it obscene and ordered all copies destroyed, though Anger had already smuggled reels out. For years, the only way to see it was at underground art spaces or midnight film societies, where audiences sat in stunned silence. What made it so dangerous? It didn't preach, it reflected. By cutting together footage of leather-clad bikers polishing, their boots with clips of Hitler rallies and Christ on the cross, Anger suggested that hero worship, whether for rock stars, rebels, or dictators, often leads down the same road. The film had no dialogue, no plot, just rhythm and symbolism. Yet it felt more urgent than most features. Today it's studied in film schools and preserved by the Library of Congress. But in 1963, it was too provocative, too poetic, too true. And that's why it could only be shown when the world was asleep, so it could wake up the few who dared to watch. Number 7. Multiple Maniacs, 1970. Before Pink Flamingos, John Waters made Multiple Maniacs a raw, black-and-white descent into chaos that feels like a carnival run by demons. Starring his muse Divine as the ringleader of a traveling freak show called The Cavalcade of Perversion, the film follows her spiral into revenge after her lover betrays her. Along the way, there's a robbery, a kidnapping, and a hallucinatory sequence inside a church that left audiences speechless. Shot for less than $5,000 in Baltimore, with friends as crew in borrowed locations, Multiple Maniacs was never meant for mainstream eyes. Waters knew that. He screened it in churches, basements, and art lofts, always at midnight, always with a warning. Police shut down several showings. One theater owner was fined just for owning a print. Yet, the film wasn't made to shock for shock's sake. It was a protest against polite society, against hypocrisy, repression, and the idea that only normal lives mattered. Divine's performance is ferocious, funny, and deeply human, and the film's DIY energy makes it feel alive, like it's breathing down your neck. For decades, it existed only on battered reels. Then, in 2016, it was restored and finally seen as what it always was. Not trash, but truth wrapped in glitter and rage. But back in 1970, it was too wild, too queer, too free for daylight. And that's why it ruled the night. Number 6. Videodrome, 1983. What if your TV started showing you things that weren't there, and your body started changing because of it? That's the nightmare at the heart of Videodrome. David Cronenberg's mind-bending thriller about a sleazy TV executive who stumbles upon a signal that broadcasts torture, hallucinations, and something far worse, reality itself breaking down. Starring James Woods as the morally slippery Max Wren, the film blends body horror, media theory, and paranoid fantasy into something no studio knew how to sell. Universal Pictures hoped for a sci-fi hit. What they got was a film where people grow VCR slots in their stomachs and guns fuse to their hands. Test audiences walked out confused. Critics called it incomprehensible. So it got buried, but not forgotten. Midnight theaters in New York, Toronto, and LA began screening it to cult crowds who saw past the grotesque imagery to its warning that media doesn't just reflect reality, it reshapes us. In an age of cable TV and emerging video culture, Videodrome asked a terrifying question. What happens when we can't tell the signal from the self? Today, it's hailed as Cronenberg's masterpiece. The Criterion Collection restored it. Scholars write about it, but in 1983, it was too strange, too smart, too disturbing for prime time, and that's why it had to wait for midnight to speak to those willing to stare into the static and see themselves staring back. Number 5, The Last House on the Left, 1972. Wes Craven's debut wasn't just a horror film, it was a gut punch disguised as entertainment. Inspired by real crime stories and the raw anger of the Vietnam era, The Last House on the Left follows two teenage girls who cross paths with a group of escaped convicts. What happens next is so unflinching, so stripped of Hollywood polish, that audiences in 1972 didn't just walk out, they demanded the film be banned. Shot on a tiny budget with handheld cameras and natural light, Craven wanted it to feel like a news report, not a movie. There are no jump scares, no monsters, just cruelty, silence, and the slow unraveling of innocence. The studio, unsure how to handle it, slapped on a fake disclaimer. To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie. But that didn't stop theaters from pulling it after just days. Police confiscated prints. Parents' groups called it sadistic. Yet it found a home always at midnight. In college towns, drive-ins, and underground theaters, it became a grim rite of passage. Over time, critics began to see its purpose. Not to exploit pain, but to expose it. The film's final act, a grieving family turning the tables, wasn't revenge porn. It was a mirror held up to a nation losing faith in justice. Today, it's recognized as a landmark of American horror, a precursor to the gritty realism of the 70s. But back then, it was too honest, too brutal, too close to home. And that's why it could only be shown when the lights were out and the world wasn't watching. Number 4, Faces of Death, 1978. What if a movie claimed to show real deaths and you couldn't tell what was staged and what wasn't? That's the unsettling power of Faces of Death. A pseudo-documentary that blurred truth and fiction so effectively, it became the ultimate forbidden film of the late 70s. Narrated by a calm doctor, it strings together scenes of accidents, animal attacks, and historical disasters, all presented as authentic. The studio knew it was too intense for regular theaters, so they sent it straight to midnight screenings, where it spread like a rumor. People whispered about the monkey brain dinner or the alligator attack, unsure if they'd just witnessed something real. Police seized copies, video stores hid it behind the counter, yet it kept circulating on bootleg tapes, late-night cable, and eventually, the internet. In truth, most of it was cleverly faked using practical effects and archival footage. But the film's genius was in its ambiguity. It forced viewers to confront a question no one wanted to ask. How much death are we willing to watch? Today, full versions are on YouTube and archive sites, often with disclaimers. But in 1978, you had to sneak into a theater after dark, heart racing, wondering, is this real? And maybe, that's the scariest question of all. Number 3, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, 1986. Shot in just 4 weeks on the streets of Chicago, Henry. Portrait of a Serial Killer isn't a thriller. It's a portrait of emptiness. Based loosely on real crimes, it follows a drifter named Henry as he drifts from one act of violence to the next, not out of rage, but boredom. There are no motives, no music, no moral, just cold, quiet horror. The MPAA refused to give it a rating for years. Without one, it couldn't play in most theaters, so it premiered at film festivals, then vanished into midnight screenings where audiences sat in stunned silence. Critics called it unwatchable, studios called it unreleasable. Yet it kept finding viewers those who saw past the discomfort to its chilling truth. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just shrugs. Michael Rooker's performance is so natural, so devoid of theatricality, that it feels like surveillance footage. The film's most infamous scene, a home invasion sequence shot in one unbroken take, was so disturbing. Some theaters stopped showing the film mid-run. Today, it's preserved in the National Film Registry. But back then, it was too real, too empty, too honest about the banality of cruelty. And that's why it had to wait for midnight to speak to those brave enough to listen. Number 2. The Devil's Rejects, 2005. Rob Zombie didn't just make a horror movie, he made a hate letter to happy endings. The Devil's Rejects follows the Firefly family, a trio of backwoods killers on the run after a police raid. But this isn't slasher fare. It's a grimy, sun-bleached road movie soaked in 70s grindhouse grit, where every frame feels like it was dug out of a landfill. Lionsgate didn't know how to sell it. Was it a sequel to House of 1,000 Corpses? A tribute to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? A twisted western? They gave it a limited release, then quietly moved it to midnight slots when mainstream audiences flinched. Critics were split. Some called it sadistic. Others, a masterpiece of nihilism. But Zombie wasn't interested in comfort. He wanted to make a film that felt dangerous, like something you shouldn't be watching. The violence isn't glamorous, the heroes aren't heroic. And the ending? No redemption. Just dust, blood, and a Lynyrd Skynyrd song playing over a final, irreversible choice. It found its audience in late-night theaters, where fans embraced its raw, unapologetic vision. Today it's seen as a turning point in horror, a film that refused to flinch. But in 2005, it was too mean, too ugly, too true. And that's why it belonged to the night. Number 1, Pink Flamingos, 1972. This is the one that broke the rules so hard, the rules had to look away. Pink Flamingos isn't just controversial, it's a declaration of war against good taste, polite society, and everything Hollywood stood for. Directed by John Waters and starring Divine as Babs Johnson, the proud winner of Filthiest Person Alive. It's a carnival of chaos where nothing is sacred and everything is possible. Shot in Baltimore with a crew of friends and a budget smaller than most weddings, the film features staged riots, food fights, and a finale so infamous it's still rarely shown uncut. When it premiered, police raided theaters, prints were seized, one city banned it for life. Studios refused to distribute it, so Waters took it to midnight, showings himself. Projector in hand, screening it in churches, basements, and art lofts where only the boldest would gather. Critics called it obscene. Parents called it evil. But for outsiders, misfits, and rebels, it was a revelation. In a world that demanded conformity, Pink Flamingos screamed, "Be yourself, no matter how weird." The Library of Congress later preserved it as culturally significant. But in 1972, it was too loud, too queer, too free for daylight. And that's why it ruled the midnight hour not as a movie, but as a movement. This is the film they tried to erase, and the one that refused to disappear. So there you have it, 15 films that were too raw, too real, or too rebellious for regular showtimes. So they took over the night. They weren't made to please. They were made to provoke, challenge, and survive. If you've seen any of these, tell us in the comments which one left you speechless. If you haven't, maybe dare to watch one after dark. And if you love stories about cinema that refuse to play it safe, hit subscribe, because sometimes the most important movies are the ones they tried to hide.